I begin by quoting the familiar Peanuts cartoon. Snoopy is on top of his doghouse, he's with a typewriter, and he's about to write his great novel. It was a dark and stormy night. Out of the silence, a shot rang out, a door slammed, a maid screamed. Suddenly, a pirate ship appeared on the horizon. While millions starved, the king lived in luxury. Meanwhile, on a small farm in Kansas, a boy was growing up. Snoopy looked up and said to his bird friend, "It's going to be a great novel. I've only written one chapter, though." I think we're all familiar with a lot of stories that begin on a dark and stormy night. A good mystery story usually begins that way. We remember Noah and his 40-day trip on the ark, Jonah, who was thrown overboard for being a cheap tipper, the Apostle Paul was shipwrecked on his way to Rome. We have Shakespeare in The Tempest, that well-known movie Titanic, The Perfect Storm out of Gloucester, Massachusetts, and we even remember Gilligan's Island and the 3-hour tour. Now, fear has a face in the Bible. It's a wet face. The sea in the Bible is a symbol of chaos. And if we think about it, since we live pretty close to the ocean, we realize that that is a very easy symbol to understand. Now, the story that we read this morning is found in 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it occurred there on the lake, or to confuse some people, the Sea of Galilee. Jesus and the disciples were out on the lake, crossing over from Capernaum to another side, and all of a sudden, there was this sudden storm. Now, that's what was explained to us when we were over in Israel, that it's basically, the lake is in kind of like a crater. And there's all these tunnels that are channels that are coming down. So the wind comes down, the hot wind hits the cold water, and it's very sudden. There's no reason for it other than nature has decided to have a storm. Now, the Gardner Museum in Boston has a Rembrandt painting entitled "The Storm on the Sea of Galilee." And we see the wind and the rain. We see the panic on the faces of the disciples. Some of them are hanging on to the mast. Others are bailing out. Others are playing with the sails. And some of them are in the back surrounding Jesus. And we can almost, it's a point, Rembrandt being who he was, we always see Jesus ready to say to them, "Why are you afraid?" What makes the painting unique is that there are 14 people in the boat. 12 disciples, 13 Jesus, and Rembrandt painted himself in the boat as well. He was telling people that he gets afraid once in a while too. Now, we're not sure what to do with stories like this, miracles. We're not impressed by too many miracles anyway. We have the fax machine, which still fascinates me, and tell out where I am in the world. But miracles-wise, people aren't used to them. They don't expect them anymore. If they can't explain it, they don't believe it. But we have to ask ourselves, are we like Rembrandt in the boat? Afraid. Are we like the disciples in the boat, wondering about this Jesus, why he doesn't do anything? Ministers are often asked to do something about the weather, like, "Oh, you have a connection." And it was often asked on the day of a wedding, or for a wedding, or a family reunion. In Indiana, this was almost every week. And the farmers would leave church shaking hands and all that, and asked, wondering why it rained so much during the week when they couldn't work. And here it was, a beautiful sunny day, and they had been taught that they could not work on Sunday as well. They didn't think that was very fair. And so they wanted a little help from their minister, you know, that old connection. And they didn't think they were getting too much for their buck. I know, you know, wind, rain, fog, high, low, he-low, whatever the case is going on. We look at the weatherman pointing to the Doppler radar, this is what's going to happen, you know. But realistically, we know Tony M. and the rest of them running around really don't have any control over it. They can just point to these screens for a couple of minutes before the commercial, and we know that they like to talk. I know up north they get paid extra every time they say the word snow. Down here it's hurricane. One of my suspicions after all these years of preaching is that sensible people like you folks and others sit here and we listen to the story of the miracle of the water, but we stop listening. We've either heard it often, which is probably the case, or it's, oh, a miracle. We weren't there, we didn't see it, we can't explain it, so we don't accept it. And there's very little a preacher can do in order to convince you that that story actually happened. Folks stop listening and they start thinking about coffee hour. Fred Craddock, who was, he's deceased now, a well-known preacher and a seminary professor, said that when he was in class, he would have, when he got to this lesson, he would have his students sit in a circle. And he'd put some plastic trash bags in the middle of the circle. And they talked about this story, and all of a sudden the students would start getting goofy, and they'd start telling jokes, because here it was a miracle, they were so sophisticated and all that sort of thing. But he's had them, being who he was, he'd say, I want you to take the story and what you don't like about it, what you don't believe, what you don't accept, I want you to take it and put that inside the bag. And we're going to get rid of it. We're going to take it out. Like Thomas Jefferson, we'll cut out the parts of the Bible we don't like. And so as part of the experiment, the bag's full, they got rid of most of it. And he says, okay, before we get rid of this bag, I want you to think again. As part of this little experiment, what is it about the story that you believe about yourself? What do you believe about God? What do you want to believe? And Craddock said that every time he did it, that they would go up and they would take parts of the story back. And the bag was usually left empty. Because after reflection, there were parts of them that they wanted to be in their lives. The story is quite clear. We have these men in the middle of this sudden storm, and they're hard working. They work there. Most of them were fishermen. They knew about storms. They knew how to handle boats. But Mark makes it very clear, as do the other two gospel writers, is that they're afraid. They are afraid. They know, they think they're going to die. Here they are in the chaos. And some of them are going crazy. Yelling, screaming, some of them are bailing out water, some of them are playing with the sails, some of them are trying to get the oars to put something in it to try to stop the boat, because it's all useless. But they're all running around doing something. And they're probably thinking to themselves, I should have said this to my wife. I should have said this to my friend. I should have taken care of this before, but now I can't. And what we have here, what makes it so special, what's so unique, is that we have little old Jesus sleeping in the bow. He's on a cushion. That means he's real comfortable. And like the old phrase is, some men can sleep through anything. and they shake him because he hasn't woken up despite all this yapping and screaming and wind blowing. Don't you care that we might die? And they might have said some other things that Mark heard and said, whoop, I can't put that in the Bible. But realistically, it wasn't, you know, oh, please, Jesus, wake up. Please, Jesus, oh, Jesus, oh, you know. It was a little, wake up, Jesus. Aren't you going to help us? And Jesus wakes up and looks at them. Why are you afraid? And he probably smiled. And he says to the waves, peace, be still. And there was silence. And the boat went on and on. They crossed over to the other side. When we went to Israel, one of the trips was to cross the Sea of Galilee, the lake. It's actually a big lake. And God smiled on me. Oh, God smiled on me. There was no sudden storms. When we were crossing over and we took the bus back, there was a sudden storm. Seriously. There was a sudden storm after lunch. No reason for it. So God said, oh, you owe me one, Bill. But to their way of thinking, the water was a hidden place. From all the enemies that were good and decent, water meant it was filled with demons. Some of you remember in school seeing maps before Columbus went out, and the maps were flat, and then you saw the edge. People thought it was all chaos with monsters. And it's always been that way in the Bible. As the earth was without limits and boundaries, it was all water, and God said, okay, we're going to have water here, and we're going to have land here. There was some sort of structure. The psalmists were convinced that the waters were filled with demons. Moses led the people of Israel to freedom by parting the Red Sea so they could walk on dry land, and then the Egyptians were destroyed in the water. And I think some of that fear of water is still with us. We have Jaws. We have Bikini Beach. We have the Titanic sinking out there. No control. No help. We are afraid of the water. And we should be. We live in Florida. But we don't believe in demons as much anymore. We don't run down the beach and scream, watch out, demons, here I come! We don't do that anymore because we're not afraid of the water. We probably should be. But, you know, the sharks come in. They could be out there and get us.
Oh, very cool.
But we have other demons in our lives. Right now, we're afraid of this virus we can't see. And we're not even sure how it jumps from us to somebody else. And so our lives have drastically changed. And they will from now on. Fear of being alone makes us that we latch on to almost anybody. And sometimes it might be an unhealthy relationship. Fear of being timid, of not handling things, makes us cautious. Fear of what might happen causes us, we have a low expectation of ourselves. And so we're afraid of doing, of believing in ourselves, of being who God called us to be. We may not be afraid of what's in the water. Maybe we should a little. But we do bring that fear on ourselves. Now the early church loved this story. They loved it because someone was in their boat. And one of the earliest symbols of the church was a ship. We are sitting in the nave. Some churches have a pitch that looks like an upside down boat. It's the Latin word for navy as well. But the early church knew what it was to be a small boat in a big sea. They had trouble with the Roman authorities. They had trouble with other larger groups, religious groups. The Jews did not like them. The Hooby-Doobies didn't like them. But they were all different. And so people tried to crush them and destroy them. But the early church loved this story, and you'll see many ships, simple ships. That is the church surviving in the crazy ocean, because they knew who was in the boat with them. They knew that they were not alone in their boat. And even in the midst of everything else, they knew that Jesus would give them a sense of peace, that he was committed to them. Realistically, we know that we're really not in charge of our lives. Accidents, disease, viruses, deaths. We've heard stories about more people testing positive in this state. More people in the racial problems in our country and what that's doing. And without warning, we can lose our love, our work, our homes, our stability. And sometimes the storms in our life are violent. And we're all in boats. Some of us are rowing like crazy. Some of us are playing with the sails. Some of us are hanging on. Some are praying. Some of us are even frozen because we do not know what to do. But what we do, and you're already doing it, is you tell somebody you're in the right place. You look around the boat. And even if it is kind of rough out there, you're telling them, you're not alone. We're in this boat together. And somebody else that we need to remember is that we are not alone because Jesus Christ is with us as well. Amen. A line from Psalm 107, "Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them from the distress. He made the storm to be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad because he had quiet, and he brought them to the desired haven." This is the truth. This is one of the things that we recovered from Fred Craddock's trash bag. That even though there might be a storm, there might be chaos, there might be a threat, God is with us. God is with us. Reinhold Niebuhr, who showed up a few weeks ago, says again, "God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." None of the gospel writers thought it was important enough to record what happened after they landed on the shore. And I bet they're sitting there. The disciples were probably exhausted, considering all their running around. And there's Jesus, finally awake, sitting on his cushion, smiling at them, knowing everything would be okay. We have Jesus with us. And that's one thing I want you to remember today, despite everything else, me running around. I'm on TV doing it. That we are not alone. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. He's in this boat right now. But when we leave this place and we go to our own boats, He's there with us as well. Amen.